I am Chalmer Goheen Jr. I was born on March 27, 1922. My family calls me Junior. My parents were Chalmer and Elizabeth Goheen. I was the youngest of 6 children. There was Margaret, Carl, Ruth, Maurice, Clarence, and then me. On November 12, 1941, I married my lovely wife, Dorothy Schreiber. And with the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, in 1941, the United States officially entered World War II. My brother Maurice joined the Marine Corps in May of 1940, Clarence joined the Navy in 1942, and I joined the Navy also on June 7, 1943. After I finished my boot camp training at Farragut, Idaho, I was sent to Norfolk, Virginia for additional training. I was stationed on the Samuel B. Roberts, a destroyer escort in Taffy 3. We called them tin cans for their lack of armor, and our job was to escort the fleets and convoys. Our high speed allowed us to keep up with the destroyers and escort carriers and aid in their defense, as well as allowed us to run our own torpedo attacks. On October 25th, in 1944, off the coast of Samar in the Philippines, we waited and watched. We sent out the occasional scouting and recon missions every couple of hours in an attempt to identify the enemy before they saw us. Our heavier counterparts had contacted the Japanese earlier that week, and we were listening to any further updates. We suspected that the Japanese had realized our plan for invading Leyte Gulf, and they were on the offensive. At 2:45 a.m., we received information that the Japanese center force had come into contact with our boys in the 7th Fleet, and then they opened fire at 10:50 p.m. Later that night, they radioed in that the Japanese were retreating. We celebrated the 7th Fleet's victory was one that we'd been waiting for. The next day, we sat and waited for any more news. We were stationed in Samar to protect our landing forces for the Leyte Gulf invasion, and we hadn't seen any airplanes or ships yet, which was lucky. But we did catch wind of the Japanese carrier group off of Cape Anado. Almost the entirety of the 3rd Fleet stationed with us had left to intercept, and with Taffy 1 launching air attacks on the Japanese southern forces, we were the last ones in Samar. At 6:30 the next morning, our anti-submarine patrol sighted a large group of ships. It was the Japanese center force. They hadn't retreated like we were told, and they had broken off to come for us. Only minutes later, a lookout shouted, "Object on the horizon! Looks like the mast of a ship!" Our alarms blared and we sent out a distress call, loud and clear. Captain Copeland buzzed over the intercom. He sounded more than a little nervous. "A large Japanese fleet has been contacted. They're 15 miles away and headed in our direction. They look to have 4 battleships, 8 cruisers, and a number of destroyers." Our ships, the USS Samuel B. Roberts, the John C. Butler, the Dennis, and the Raymond, made ready for battle as we steamed off towards the enemy, pumping out thick black funnel smoke to cover our escort carriers and jeep transports behind us. At 6:55, lookouts reported shell splashes close by. They looked to be large caliber marking shells used to help gunners identify ranges. Over the 1MC, Captain Copeland addressed us again. "We will be entering a fight against overwhelming odds, from which survival cannot be guaranteed, during which time we will do as much damage as we can." We were shocked. He said it like we were going to die. He said it like we couldn't survive. We coordinated an attack through a rain squall to try to hide our approach on the Japanese. And when we got a good angle on one of their ships, we made our torpedo one. We went for one of their cruisers. We launched the torps and waited for the explosion. But there wasn't one. We either missed or they were duds. In our retreat, 3 8-inch shells entered the broadside of the Roberts. It felt like you were on a bedsheet on a clothesline in the storm, whipping in the wind. The shells hit the engine room, cutting our auxiliary power, shutting off the lights. The boiler room was second. The ship rocked from an explosion that felt like it came from directly under the ship. Some of us felt like the ship raised a couple feet in the air, and we could hear the screams of sailors as the boiler room exploded and covered them in the water. The last one hit the communications gyro room, making us unable to get new orders from our commanding ship. We were limping now. We turned and targeted the next ship. We had lost all maneuverability from the engine damage, and that caused many more shells to come in contact with us, including some shells that were such a large caliber they went straight through without damaging anything. We still had enough speed to make another torpedo attack on one of their heavy cruisers, so we went in for another torpedo run. We got so damn close their guns couldn't depress enough to fire on us. On our 2 runs, we had shot over 300 shells at varying ships. At first, we used our armor-penetrating rounds. After that, we used our high explosive. And when we ran out of those, we resorted to using our star shells, which only managed to spark a couple fires on their decks. When we completed our second run, we had lost all speed, and on top of that, we had almost collided with the Butler, causing us to be at 5 knots in the middle of an army. Shortly after, 3 more shells entered our ship, one slamming our forward gun number 1, another destroying the engine room completely, and the third went straight through the aft of our ship. Only one of our 5-inch guns, number 52, remained. And as I ran around the deck trying to help as many men as I could, one of our shells misfired and exploded the breech of the gun with a deafening roar. After the damage assessment, Captain Copeland gave the order to abandon ship, as we could fight no more. I made my way topside to check on Paul Henry Carr's gang, who manned gun 3, number 52. I made my way to the gun, and where the water hadn't reached yet, the deck was covered in burning oil and gas. I had to maneuver around that deck with the utmost precision. Most of the men inside the gun had been obliterated. As I looked into the mount, I saw Paul Carr sitting in the corner. In his arms, he was cradling the last of the 325 shells. Paul was alive, though barely. He was torn from his neck to his groin, and he begged me to help him get off the last shell. I took the shell and set it to the side and helped lay him on the floor. I then grabbed James Gregory, who had lost his leg. It had been severed at the hip. I carried him out of the turret, and when I got back into the mount, Paul was up again, holding the shell. I took the shell again and carried him out on the deck. He shortly died thereafter. I asked George Bray, who was standing on the fantail, I asked him if he could help me get some of the wounded overboard. He said yes. I brought Willard Thurmord to Bray. He helped Thurmord get to the rail. Bray could tell he was a goner. The mortally injured man just held on there, and he decided to help some of the others off the ship. And then made his way to the fantail, and by the time he reached the depth charge rack, the water was up to his waist, and he could just sit down and start swimming. We got as many men onto the rafts as we could. Nobody had saw Captain Copeland, so we figured he was either dead or going down with the ship. The Roberts went down by her stern. We slowly entered the water, which was covered in an inch thick of diesel and oil. Sections of the water had been lit ablaze, and now the water itself was a hazard, besides the obvious of drowning. Several of our survivors were in life rafts. We clung to anything that could float. We were covered in oil and gas, burning our eyes and singeing our lungs. Some of the men who ingested it began to retch and started to gag, same as the ones that got the seawater in. As we hung on to the bits and pieces of the Roberts, we started to see sharks, dozens of them, preying on the sailors who drifted without cover. Some of us had took our oil-covered clothes off to lighten the weight and to help us swim. But the sharks liked that. They bumped into one of our sailors and tried to nibble on him. It seems the oil was a natural deterrent to the sharks. Either they didn't like the smell, or maybe it was the taste. But we hastily put our clothes back on, and some of us even smeared the oil back on ourselves, trying to get as much cover. Fighting soon broke out over the rafts as men wanted out of the water and away from the sharks. At one point, we counted 50 shark fins cutting through the surface near us. And thanks to the oil covering us, these predators were all swimming no bite. Though we couldn't be too confident in that. Every time a fin moved closer and then disappeared under the water, we feared the worst. At some suggested we sing. A half-hearted attempt was made, but the hearts weren't in it, and mostly we stayed quiet. As we saw more shark fins start to cut out, and some of us started to suffer from deliria, we think, fighting started to break out again. Some of the men were climbing over one another like frantic to leave the water. They pushed one another down, clutching and grabbing with death-grip strength. George Gray and I tried to quell the panic, but it had a life of its own. Finally, after the men had worn themselves out, it stopped by itself. No ship came to save us that night. It was feared the Japanese had won the battle. And after our ships went down and we saw the Japanese set off towards Samar, we could only think of how the island was defenseless. Sometime during the night, a shout was heard. It was from Howard Cahill. He had been on the scaffolding of one of the other ships that went down. He had left his group after the sharks started picking off the sailors. He was one of the few from his group that had survived the attacks. And now, the fear worsened. Clutching the floating net hitched to the raft, we started to try and get us somewhere near the land. Some of us tried, and other ones were either too wounded or too scared to help. And around midnight, we stopped paddling to rest and to orient ourselves by the position of the moon. One by one, we fell asleep. When we woke at early daybreak, we discovered that we had drifted farther out into sea. We didn't know at the time, but of the three groups from the ships, we were now all 32 miles apart from each other and drifting in a different direction. While we had slept, the currents had seemed to shift. We had drifted significantly farther out to sea, and we didn't know if we would ever reach land again. Our Caphlock life vests, no longer of much use, soaked through with seawater. The hard rubber discs had sponged so much water that they were just weighing us down at this point. The same with the net. The net that hung off the rafts was weighed down so much that some of the survivors had to make a conscious effort to keep their head above the water. The weariest and weakest of them have resigned themselves to death now. George Gray, Mel Dent, myself, and two others decided to take our own chances, swimming to shore. We had gone a mile or so, the rising sun behind us lighting our way, and when we spotted a dark shape on the horizon. It seemed to be getting closer. It was a ship. The rising sun of the Imperial Japan was heading our way. We decided if we were going to die, we might as well go down with the rest of our shipmates. So we turned around and swam back towards the raft. By the time we had returned to the raft, the ship was nearly upon us, whipping in the wind the ship's flag. We now see, partially wrapped around its masts, it's a field of blue and white stars. We could not trust our eyes. As it eased up, we could see Old Glory flying from its masts. The vessel coming towards us was from a patrol from the 7th Fleet. When they got to us, they challenged our nationality by asking, "Who won the World Championship?" Mel Dent replied without hesitation, "The St. Louis Cardinals." And someone else in our group added, "Now get me out of the water, you sob." It was about 9 a.m. on Navy Day on October 27th. I was taken to Australia for medical treatment as needed. On December 5th in 1944, I was sent home. I was discharged in September of 1945 after being hospitalized for 3 months. Chalmer Goheen Jr. died in 1968. Chalmer Goheen Jr., Metalsmith 2nd Class, United States Naval Reserve. For heroic service as a crewman on board the USS Samuel B. Roberts during the operations against enemy Japanese forces in the Battle off Samar on October 25th, 1944, although his vessel was still under fire and the order to abandon ship had been given, Goheen repeatedly entered a burning gun mount to remove seriously wounded members of his crew. His courage and grave concern for the safety of others was in the highest keeping and was in the highest of traditions in the United States Naval Service. Chalmer Goheen is authorized to wear the Bronze Star. In the Battle of Samar, 5 of the 13 U.S. ships were sunk. 1,583 men were lost on the ships, and 2,000 survivors waited 2 days in the sea for rescue, many succumbing to shark attacks and exposure. Destroyers who fought like battleships. The Japanese fleet that Taffy III encountered was a center fleet of the Japanese Imperial Navy, consisting of 23 ships, including the Yamato and Musashi, the prides of the Japanese Navy, and the biggest battleships in history to date. The Yamato itself displaced more than the entire of Taffy III and the 9 carrier escorts that they were defending. This is one of the heroes of the battle story and a small account of what happened in the Battle of Samar. Chalmer's story was taken from the book, The Last Stand of the Tin Can Sailors by James D. Horn Fisher.